This presentation was recorded at the Informa Rail Decarbonising Conference in September 2022 in Sydney. If you've seen my previous video on can hydrogen replace diesel, there is a fair amount of overlap. Our ex-Prime Minister went to Glasgow last year and met Boris and was persuaded to sign up to the zero emissions target for 2050. And the thing is, that changes everything because it affects not just electricity generation, but all sectors of the economy, including transport. And it doesn't just cut in on 31st of December in 2049. There's steps to be taken along the way. So, for example, the EU is looking at banning all cars which emit CO2 from 2035 onwards, and California's doing the same thing. In the UK, they're looking at banning all diesel-only trains from 2040. So Australia's going to have to respond in the same way due to our international commitments. In Australia, transport contributes about 100 million tonnes of CO2, and rail is about 4 million tonnes. So it's only 1% of Australia's total CO2 emissions, and 1%, well, that's next to nothing. But there's a big difference between 1 and 0. Just ask any computer. And getting to that zero is going to be a real problem. And one of the things is diesel's going to be more or less banned. And that's a real problem because we've got a lot of diesel locos. A lot of them are very old. For example, this 81 class in the photo here, it's nearly 40 years old. I think Prue told us yesterday that PN's got 585 locomotives. Well, these contribute 83 of those 585. The locos behind it, they're 48 class, they're over 50 years old. So we've got a lot of old locos out there. And if you decide, I'm going to order a new, more efficient loco so it's got lower emissions, and you order it tomorrow, how long will it be in service before it's banned? We urgently need an alternative. And I just put a photo there of the new regional rail trains which New South Wales has ordered from Spain. The first one should be arriving next year. There's 117 of them. They're diesel. That could be an interesting problem. But there's a more immediate threat than even legislation and international commitments, and that's, I guess, due to private enterprise. We've seen a total revolution in electric cars in the last few years. Well, the revolution's happening now. Like 10 years ago, an electric car was a kind of a rich boy's toy, but now we're seeing electric cars with a range of 300 to 500 kilometres. The price is coming down. In Europe, EV sales are already 17% of all new cars and 14% in China, and we are about to see a flood of moderately priced electric cars coming from China in the next year or so. A few years ago, people would have said, and I would have said, that a long-distance electric truck wasn't really possible. Elon Musk has been promising his semi since 2017, I think, but it does look like it's about to go into production now, maybe late this year, early next year, and he's promising a range of 500 miles or 800 kilometres, which is the distance to Melbourne. So we could be seeing a truck that can go from Sydney to Melbourne, all electric, no emissions, very soon. Now, even if that happens, obviously we're not going to change all trucks overnight. It might take 10 years before we see a significant number of trucks, or maybe half the fleet in 10 years' time by 2032. But it just turns the whole equation upside down. We've been saying that rail is the most efficient, therefore it's the lowest emission form of transport. That argument's turned on its head if trucks are zero emissions. Now you might argue, but the electricity is not zero emissions, that we're still burning coal. And that's true. So at the moment, our electricity generation is about 33% renewables. The left-hand chart there, it shows you the last year, month by month, the proportion of renewable versus the proportion of fossil, which is mainly coal. And over the year, renewables are about 33%. Now, the Labor government's target is 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, and that requires 82% renewables. I think that will not be achieved, but it'll probably be at least 50, 60% renewables, and it will be moving in that direction. It will be moving in the direction of increased renewables. So, trucks which are charged from the grid are going to be increasingly getting towards zero emissions. In rail, we've obviously got electrification. That's the obvious way of getting to zero emissions. The trouble with the electrification, as has been mentioned before, it's expensive. It costs about $2.5–3 million a kilometre to electrify. And that cost is only justified where you've got high traffic volumes. So in Australia, all the capital cities have electrified rail systems. In Europe and in Japan, you find even between the major cities, it's electrified. And because you've got trains going past every few minutes, and so that justifies the cost. But when you've got lines where trains only go past every few hours, like in most of Australia outside the cities, you can't really justify that. Like, for example, Canberra, that's a national capital. It only gets 3 trains a day, and these are little trains, just 3 carriages. Plus there's 1 freight train a week, which carries Canberra's only export. But there's not much to keep train spotters busy in Canberra. On these sort of branch lines where you've got infrequent traffic, at the moment diesel's the only solution. So what are the alternatives to diesel? Well, there's batteries, and you've seen electric cars. We're now talking 500 kilometre range. On trains, batteries are still pretty heavy, and axle loads and space mean that range is kept down to around about 100 kilometres. So this also Bombardier Talent battery electric multiple unit, like it operates with a pantograph like a normal EMU, and it can go around 100 kilometres on batteries. And that just entered service in January. They're only just starting to come into service now. So what do you do when you want to go more than 100 kilometres? And that's where hydrogen is proposed. It's talked about as being the best alternative for longer distances. And why hydrogen? Well, hydrogen fuel cells are favoured because, well, they are zero emissions, no CO2, no NOx. Efficiency is roughly twice that of internal combustion engines. Hydrogen can be made by electrolysis from water using renewable energy. The expectation is green hydrogen will become cheaper. The energy density is really high. It's over 3 times that of diesel, which is why they use it for rocket fuel. Its energy density is 200 times that of batteries, but there is some fine print if you look there. And there are some obstacles to the use of hydrogen. So why not hydrogen? And the first problem is the volume problem. Because it's such a light gas, it needs to be either compressed or liquefied to get any amount of it onto a train or anywhere. So in this picture, I've got a red arrow there to the fuel tank. It's just kind of a rectangular box underneath, holds 10,000 litres of fuel, that's 10 cubic metres. In the table, look at the bottom line, even liquid hydrogen, the equivalent energy is 45 cubic metres, and at 35 megapascals, 136 cubic metres, that's the volume of the whole loco above the underframe. And if you're wondering why 35 megapascals and 70 megapascals, which is 350 bar or 700 bar, they're kind of industry standards, and it's 5,000 and 10,000 psi in the old measure. So why not compressed hydrogen? So we're talking about pressures which are extremely high. Like, we use compressed air on trains for the brakes and so on. Here we're talking about pressures which are 100 times greater. And we do have the odd air leak on trains at the moment. 35 megapascals requires thick-walled, small diameter, carbon fibre reinforced vessels. You can't have a big diameter vessel. And what they're typically getting is about 6% weight for weight. So the weight of hydrogen in the tank is 6% the weight of the tank. So for example, the Toyota Mirai, its tanks weigh 88 kilograms and hold 5 kilograms of hydrogen. So once you take the tank into account, and this is a carbon fibre tank, it's really only about 6 times that of batteries. So on a loco, that loco in the picture before, that fuel tank made of sheet steel, it weighs under 3 tonnes. It holds nearly 3 times its weight in fuel. If you had the equivalent energy in hydrogen, that tank would be 47 tonnes, which is almost half the way to the loco. One of the things is with these very high pressures, these tanks, because they fatigue, you have to throw them away after about 8 or 10 years. Just thinking in the recycling economy, you could actually use those tanks maybe for storing carbon dioxide or something. Next thing is the difficulty in distribution. So like a tanker, like a road tanker of diesel fuel, will haul about, you'll have 30,000 litres or more. A steel tube trailer, as Colin was talking about, the trailer weighs 27 tonnes and carries about 300 kilograms of hydrogen. That's at 180 bar. Plus, every time you move the hydrogen from one tank to another, you have to recompress it. And the energy of recompression can be up to 10% of the energy of the hydrogen. So there's a significant cost in dollars and energy just in moving hydrogen around to where you want it. And liquid hydrogen does actually solve some of those problems because it's a lot denser. So why not liquid hydrogen? Liquid hydrogen, well, hydrogen is liquid at 20 degrees above absolute zero. That's minus 253 degrees C. So you can see in that picture the guy refueling his truck. You know he's not using liquid hydrogen because he's not wearing gloves. So a tank to hold liquid hydrogen has to be very much insulated, like a vacuum flask with a double wall, a vacuum in between. And even so, the gas is going to slowly boil off. So you have to vent the tank, and you're probably losing about 1% of your hydrogen per day being vented. The work to liquefy, it's roughly a third of the energy in the hydrogen. So that's a big upfront loss of energy. Although once you've got it as a liquid, it's easier to move it around. And you do need a fairly capital-intensive facility to produce liquid hydrogen to get it down to that temperature. And then there's efficiency. Although fuel cells are very efficient compared to an internal combustion engine, they're really still only around 50%. Efficiency decreases with load. So if you look on that graph, the green line in the middle, you can see it's up above 50% down at the low end, but when you're starting to get up to maximum power, the efficiency is dropping off and it's down to maybe 42% or so, and that's the overall efficiency because you have to take into account cooling and the rest of it. When you look at the overall cycle from your solar panel through all the way down to your traction motor on a train, you're really only about 25% efficient. Whereas when you put the power into batteries, you get about 90% of it back. And yet, in spite of all those problems, the technology does exist. And the Alstom Cordia iLint has been running, well, two prototypes running in Germany since 2018. And just 2 weeks ago, I believe, a fleet of 12 went into service in Lower Saxony in Germany. These replace DMUs, that's diesel multiple units. So this train is based on a diesel multiple unit, but with the diesel and other traction equipment replaced. So you've got an engine which is 335 kilowatts, replaced with a 200 kilowatt fuel cell, and batteries that give 600 kilowatts peak power. So the way it works is, like the fuel cells are giving a constant recharge, and the batteries are giving you high power when you need it. And the range is, I've said 800 kilometres, but apparently they're getting 1,000 kilometres out of it. And the amount of hydrogen you can store on board is the limitation. And there are at least a dozen projects around the world where other people are trying to do the same thing. Siemens, Tashi, others are following basically the same concept. And the iLint, you can see on the left, the fuel cells are down one end. There's a whole lot of fans there because you have to reject half the energy that's in the hydrogen goes out as heat, so 200 kilowatts of heat to be rejected. And because fuel cells operate at a relatively low temperature, you're rejecting heat at about 70 degrees, so you do need a lot of cooling area. And the middle part of the roof is all taken up with these small diameter tanks. So could hydrogen replace DMUs in Australia? Victoria has a very large DMU fleet, the Velocities, there's over 100 of them. New South Wales is about half the number, serving the Hunter Valley and the Southern Highlands. And they, like some of your longer trips, are like Sydney to Canberra is 320 kilometres and Melbourne to Albury is also 320 kilometres. The iLint could easily do that, being refuelled just at the one end in the capital city. For longer distances, like Sydney to Brisbane or Sydney to Melbourne, they're just under 1,000 kilometres. You're pushing it, it would probably just about make it. But these are, in Australia, high-speed trains run slowly. So these trains could do it. If you wanted to go faster, like just to sustain about 130 kilometres per hour or so, you would need twice the number of fuel cells, because you're not just drawing on the battery, you've got to generate the power continuously. And if you want to go from 130 to 200 kilometres per hour, because it's a square law with speed, you need double again. So you're talking about 4 times the number of fuel cells, which means a train of a different configuration. By the way, the picture is a New South Wales Explorer. That's the kind of train that runs to Canberra at the moment, but with 3 carriages. It's one thing to refuel a prototype. Like you can have a tanker and a portable unit to pump it up. If you want to run a fleet, like they're now doing in Lower Saxony in Germany, this place, this picture on the right, it's the refueling station at, I think it's pronounced Bremerförde in Lower Saxony, which just, as I say, opened last month, I believe. I think it's the 24th of August, I saw in the press. So if you look at what's in the picture, on the left-hand side, there are 64 of these torpedo-type vessels, which hold, altogether, they hold 1.8 tonnes of hydrogen at 500 bars. It's kept at constant pressure, and the big tanks on the right, they're big diameter, but they're holding oil, which is used to displace the hydrogen, so you keep the tanks at a constant pressure, so you can just push it straight into the train when it comes in, without the pressure doesn't drop as you fill it. And the hydrogen comes from a gas plant about 35 kilometres away by road. So you've got 8 to 10 road trailer tankers coming in per day. And bear in mind, this is replacing the equivalent of 1 tanker of diesel fuel coming every second day. So this is a way to put 15 extra trucks on the road. What about locomotive haul trains? Diesel electric locos haul bulk goods like coal, minerals, grain, and some long-distance intermodal freight. And I'm particularly interested in intermodal because that's what we're trying to grow. Between Melbourne and Sydney, when I joined the rail industry back in the 1980s, like it was falling, but it was still about 25% of freight between Sydney and Melbourne went by rail. It's now less than 1%. It's just tacked onto a train running to Brisbane. And the question is, will hydrogen help us reverse this trend to road transport? A mainline loco needs about 3,000 kilowatts of continuous power, and you could do that with fuel cells. So I just looked at the figures, like a 3,000 tonne train running from Sydney to Melbourne, hauled by 2 locomotives. If it's diesel, and these are just some simulations I did, but say 5,500 litres of fuel for a loco. If it's a hybrid, if you combine it with a battery, you could get that down to about 3,900. And if it's hydrogen, you need about 1,150 kilograms. And I just calculated the CO2 for each. And the hydrogen one, even if the hydrogen's coming from natural gas, and at the moment, nearly all hydrogen is made by reforming natural gas, there is actually still a CO2 advantage. But if it was renewable, made with an electrolyser, of course it'd be 0. So how do you carry this compressed hydrogen? Like, you don't need exactly the amount. You need to have at least a 10-15% buffer. So you need 1,300 kilograms per loco to be carried. And you won't fit that on the loco. And in fact, if you put these in these tubes, I worked out, and you stack them, like this picture here, obviously there's no picture of a wagon with all these tubes on it, so it looks something like this if you use your imagination, these pipes. So they're stacked in a matrix, 6 by 6. You could just about get the 58, well, you need 59 cubic metres of hydrogen compressed at 35 megapascals. And these would have to be carbon fibre, not these old pipes. Each train would need 2 of these wagons, like 1 per loco as a minimum. It might even be a bit more to get from Melbourne to Sydney. But then think about the logistics of supplying the hydrogen to this train. You would need 8 of those truck trailers to get the hydrogen. So if they come in sequentially, it's going to take you 8 hours probably filling it 5 kilograms a minute. So you're going to take 8 hours. Or you could have one of those facilities like at Bremerförde. That's just to refuel 1 train. And if we're going to replace all the trucks between Sydney and Melbourne, you're going to need 10 trains a day running each direction. So you'll need 10 of those, a facility 10 times the size of that one. And the compression energy is not insignificant. You need to fill the hydrogen for one loco, 4 megawatt hours. It'd be good if you could deliver it by a pipeline from a reservoir somewhere, rather than trucking it in. In fact, not only good, you have to. Or you could have a 25 megawatt electrolyser on site. That would generate enough for five trains. Or you could look at liquid hydrogen. So the 1,300 kilograms, that's about 18,300 litres. You still probably wouldn't fit on a loco because it's not a rectangular box like in the photo. You need a big round vessel, double walls, insulated. So you're probably going to need a tanker. So this picture here is actually of an LNG tank wagon, and that's got plenty of volume. So in fact, you could fit the fuel for 4 locos or 2 locos that would run all the way from Melbourne to Brisbane. So yeah, making it liquid is a bit more practical in that sense. But handling liquid hydrogen, it does require special handling. It's a cryogenic, and it's at a horrendously low temperature. You can't push that through any old hose. Long distance freight trains, rail is still competitive on the really long distance routes. So I've already mentioned Melbourne to Brisbane. You need about 12,000 litres of diesel per loco. So, but one tanker of liquid hydrogen would easily do 2 locos. But compressed gas, you'd need 2 flat wagons of those pipes per loco to do it, which is getting a bit impractical. On the really long distance routes like Adelaide to Perth or up to Darwin, they already take a tanker with them. So if you can see in this photo, if you look, it's not a very good angle, but if you look behind the locos, you can see the white tanks there. They take the diesel with them, so you don't have to stop to fill it up in the middle of the nullarbor. You notice that black stuff coming out the top. That's carbon. That's all right because it's carbon dioxide, which causes global warming. This blocks the sun, so it's fine. It's interesting comparing liquid hydrogen to LNG. About 10 years ago in the US, there was a lot of interest in LNG just in natural gas as a fuel, because it was, at the time, it was about 20% the price of diesel, and it's lower emissions too. There's a lot of research, but it went nowhere, and only one operator, as far as I know, has really adopted using any sort of natural gas, but they're using LNG, and that's this Florida East Coast. They've converted 24 locos. So this tank here, you can see, it's a double wall vessel with a gap in between with a vacuum. It's built on a crash-resistant frame. The LNG has to be vaporised before you transfer it to loco, because you don't want this cryogenic fluid going through rubber hoses. And that's what all that pipe work is on the left-hand photo. They take the radiator water from the loco, goes back there and heats it up, so it's vaporised. But LNG is pretty controversial in the US because of the risk of this acronym. It's a boiling liquid expanding vapour explosion. And there's been some terrible ones, like in Cleveland, Ohio, it was back in 1944, an LNG tank ruptured, the liquid flowed into the sewers, and then it boiled and it blew up, and over 200 people were killed. And you've got lac mégantic, there's any French person here, accident we had back in 2013 where a train blew up in the middle of town. And if you look up the earthjustice.com or .org site, they'll tell you about all the disasters with LNG. They say that an LNG train with 22 tanks has the explosive equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb. And they're just waiting to be able to say something about a hydrogen bomb, I can tell you. Is there a way of safely storing hydrogen at a better density than we've got at the moment? And there is one. It's very counterintuitive. But if you fill your tank with metal powder first, you can get more hydrogen in. That's because it goes in between the atoms, so it's solid state storage. And it is safe because it's slow to go in, but it's slow to come out. So even if you rupture your tank, it's not going to come flowing out. And the material is relatively cheap, but there is a weight versus volume trade-off. So one particular hydro I looked at, which works at room temperature, it's iron and nickel, and it stores about 2% by weight. So suddenly you're back to a heavy storage again. Like you've got your volume down to something which is manageable, but you're not much better than batteries in terms of energy and weight. And then there's ammonia. Ammonia is hydrogen joined to a nitrogen atom. It's a carbon-free fuel. Liquefied ammonia stores more hydrogen than hydrogen does, which is a bit odd. Counterintuitive. That's by volume, not by weight. Ammonia is made by the Haber-Bosch process, but it could be made from green hydrogen. It liquefies at minus 33 degrees, which just requires normal refrigeration, not this. It's not down near absolute zero. The cycle energy, it does use energy, but it's similar to liquid hydrogen. And the CSIRO, a couple of years ago, they demonstrated that they could fill a Toyota Mirai with hydrogen being made from ammonia, in real time. The conversion was happening as you were filling the car. So that would be a way of storing and moving hydrogen around. Or you can actually burn the hydrogen as fuel. Ammonia can be used to fuel a diesel engine. Problem is it's got very poor auto-ignitability. So generally people will use diesel as a pilot fuel, and then you can burn the ammonia. It does produce high NOx though, so you need to have after treatment, which is a bit of a problem. And any unburnt ammonia in the exhaust is toxic. So ammonia has less than half the energy of diesel, so you do need to carry more around. And again, if it's refrigerated, you probably need a tanker rather than storing it on the loco. This tanker here, you can use LPG. This is not LNG, LPG, liquid petroleum gas. Those tankers are around. One of those would take 2 locos from Sydney to Brisbane. Will hydrogen be cheap and green? You've got to consider the cost. At the moment, grey hydrogen is about the same price as steak per kilogram. Producing it, you get about 6 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen. So it's not that green. The hope is that green hydrogen made by electrolyzers will be cheap and abundant. But the reality today, back in January, Australia exported its first shipload of liquid hydrogen to Japan. It was made by gasifying brown coal. Then it was taken by road to Port Hastings down on Dandenong Peninsula and liquefied and sent off to Japan. So there's no carbon capture and storage. So as of today, it's not very green. So the conclusion, can hydrogen reverse the shift to the road? Well, a technical solution does exist for regional DMUs. High-speed passenger trains, it's going to be more difficult. Freight trains will require tender wagons of some sort. Neither compressed gas nor liquid hydrogen are easy solutions. But I think ammonia or hydrides may be the way forward. And I expect there'll be a decade of experimentation and development, and I'm sure some of the hurdles will be overcome, but it's not ready today. And it's all contingent on there being cheap hydrogen from renewables, which may not happen till who knows when. And I think they'll be too late to reverse a shift to road. So my takeaway is I think we have to squeeze everything we can out of electrification and batteries starting today. Thank you.